Thank you for joining us today. My name is Andrew Brown, and I have the privilege of serving as the director for the Center for Families and Children at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. And those of you who are in from out of town, I hope that you've had the opportunity to at least leave the hotel for a little bit and explore the city. I know that it is fashionable for conservatives to hate on the city of Austin, but for me personally, someone who lives here, when I give constructive criticism to this city, it does come from a place of love for this town where my wife and I have chosen to raise our family. Whenever somebody asks me what Austin is like, I often respond by asking them to close their eyes and picture a town designed by Willie Nelson. Austin has long been a hot spot for music, arts, and culture. But what makes this city unique as compared to other cities that are known for those things, what makes it truly special, is that independent Texas spirit forged in 1836 that lies at the heart of it all. Sadly, that spirit doesn't feel as strong as it used to. Years of progressive big government policies from City Hall aimed at, to quote one official city document, achieving social behavioral adaptation, are taking their toll across the city. And those harmed most are those most in need. As you drove in from the airport or walked around the city, you likely saw evidence of that harm. Tents and ramshackle structures are popping up under overpasses and in vacant lots all over town. These encampments, which sprang up after the city council repealed restrictions on public camping, have become a symbol of Austin's homelessness crisis. But this is a crisis that's been a long time in the making, much longer than the public camping ordinance restrictions. Between 2013 and 2018, the number of people experiencing homelessness in Austin grew by almost 30%. And now for context, this is more than double the rate of the city's total population growth in that period of time. Although most immediately think of Los Angeles, Seattle, San Francisco, Portland, and now, sadly, Austin, Texas, when they think of the homelessness crisis, the crisis is not isolated to those areas. According to data from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, the total number of people experiencing homelessness in the United States rose in 2019 for the third straight year, with 21 states reporting an increase in their homelessness populations. The sudden visibility of the homelessness crisis has forced a long overdue conversation about how to address the problem here in Austin and across the country. The modern homelessness crisis is one that requires us to question the status quo and push for innovative solutions that target the root causes that put individuals and families at risk. I'm thrilled to be joined today by an exceptional group of people, all of whom are actively involved in the fight against homelessness. Robert Marboot Jr. was appointed by President Trump in December to serve as the executive director of the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness, and in this role, he is responsible for coordinating the federal government's response to the homelessness crisis. Director Marboot has an extensive experience designing and implementing successful responses to homelessness, having served as the founding president and CEO of Haven for Hope, a homeless services campus in San Antonio, and as a consultant to cities and service providers across the country. As part of his work, Director Marboot has visited a total of 931 homeless service operations in 28 states, plus Washington, D.C. and Mexico City. He has lived 157 days on the streets and in shelters as part of his research into the homelessness crisis. While not born in Texas, Director Marboot has deep connections to the Lone Star State, earning his PhD from the University of Texas at Austin, and serving as a city council member and mayor pro tem of San Antonio. His impressive resume also includes a stint as a White House fellow under President George H.W. Bush. Elena Davis, on the end, is the former CEO and founder of I Am Waters Foundation, a nonprofit that delivered 5 million water bottles to America's homeless. Water bottles provided by I Am Waters have been placed at each of your seats. If you haven't already, take a look at that water bottle, and Elena, if you could hold it up. You've got one up here. These words of inspiration on these water bottles are intended to provide encouragement to those experiencing homelessness and motivate them to do what it takes to reach their full potential. Elena's own life is proof that the American dream is real, and anyone, even someone who grew up in extreme poverty on less than $3,000 per year, can build a better life. Her personal experiences and profound belief in the power of faith, hope, and love led Elena to create a platform for changing the perception of America's homeless and challenging policymakers and service providers to take a hard look at the effectiveness of the strategies that they are employing for ending homelessness. And finally, Michelle Stieb is the former executive director of St. John's Program for Real Change in Sacramento, California. She currently serves as a consultant for the development of public and private partnerships. Under her leadership, St. John's transformed from a 30-day emergency shelter on the verge of bankruptcy to an 18-month program that supports 270 women and children each day as they work to actively address and overcome the root causes that are contributing to their experience of poverty and homelessness. The trauma-informed approach that Michelle instituted at St. John's, which includes mental health services, drug and alcohol counseling, educational assistance, and extensive employment training, has resulted in a 96% employment rate among the women who complete the program. Like so many, Michelle is a recent immigrant to Texas from the state of California who came here in search of a better life. I'm also very grateful for her friendship and collaboration. She served as an invaluable resource to the foundation as we've been developing our policy initiative surrounding homelessness. So please join me in welcoming our panel. So Elena, I'd like to start with you so that we can properly orient our mindset, because I think it's really easy to look at this problem based on data and statistics and lose sight of the humanity of the folks that are struggling with homelessness. Could you just give us a little bit of your story and how that contributed to your passion for this issue?
Yeah, and I don't know if this is working. I hope it is. Hello, my name is Elena Davis, and I'm most excited about being here with Robert Marva to tell you the truth. This is a great new change coming. My background, I am one of 4 children who was raised by a woman who was raised in an orphanage home. And we grew up in pretty abject poverty and transience. I was raised on $3,000 a year in food stamps. And my mother, in between, worked as a stripper, as a prostitute, and I have lived everywhere from Indian reservations to brothels to everywhere. I attended 12 schools and dropped out in the 8th grade. We had arrived in Hollywood, California at the time. And I got a job at a pizza place in Century City that I could eat whatever I wanted for free on my shift, and I took it. I dropped out of the 8th grade. We were starving. This was kind of pre a lot of the great food banks and organizations now. And in that pizza place, I was discovered by Eileen Ford. So at 16, I moved to Paris and ended up working as a model for 15 years and had a very, very lucrative career. I worked in Paris. I traveled all over the world. I lived in New York for a long time. I bought a home for my family at 21 years old, which is in Manhattan Beach in Los Angeles. And I put my siblings through school and tried to get my mom stabilized, but my mother still deals with transience and some mental health issues from the way that she was raised. I ended up meeting my husband at a dinner party for the Duchess of York in Beverly Hills in 1991. And every step that I took, my life kept going further and further away from the way that I was raised, which was pretty dark and bleak. And I never told anybody, I'm like shaking now, but I never told anybody how I was raised. I had a lot of shame, a lot of embarrassment. I was a voracious reader, so I was kind of able to cover up the fact that I hadn't had a very extensive formal education, and didn't look back. I ended up being asked for water by a homeless woman in a Houston intersection, which is what has kicked off I Am Waters. to date, we have delivered 5 million bottles of water. We're the only organization, and we're not an organization anymore. I actually am doing this on my own now. I am Waters. But 12 cities, 6 states, and more importantly, I think on your seats is a study that I did with our academic partner UCLA and UT, and it's about the water needs of the domestic homeless. This I look at as a technology. This is the way in which we have addressed homelessness and have connected to the homeless and have created this amazing bond through all the organizations that this has come through. But that's basically it. That's my background is,
Thank you for sharing that.
Ta-da.
It's an inspiring story of just overcoming and then going back to help those who are still struggling. And I think it's something that we can all learn a lot from. Michelle, you've also been personally involved in responding to this crisis. The organization you ran in Sacramento, St. John's Program for Real Change, started out as an emergency shelter, but it shifted to a life change model under your leadership. Tell us about that transition and how you moved away from government funding to private funding.
So when I joined St. John's in 2007, my first week was that the food truck didn't come because we hadn't paid our bills. We bounced 2 employees' payroll checks. The executive director at the time was on vacation and unreachable for 2 weeks, so the bookkeeper, who was a young guy, kind of buckled under pressure from it all and quit. That was my first week. That was my first day. Actually, that was the day after my first day. So anyway, once we got St. John's stabilized, I was actually donated to St. John's for a month to fix the problems. Never went back to my career. My career was political, and I loved my job. But after being at St. John's even for 1 hour, I decided that's where I wanted to be for the rest of my life until my husband moved here. So. So I didn't immigrate here for a better life, but it is a great life. It is a great life, and I did not bring my politics here either, right? So just want to make that clear. So my first week, we had a woman named Katie come in with her daughter Tori. And by the way, I want to just say we were started in 1985 on the steps of a church, so we had been around for about 25 years at that point. So Katie comes in with her daughter Tori, and a couple days later, a woman named Shelley comes in with her 2 boys. And I was shocked to learn that Katie and Shelley were sisters. They were actually half-sisters. But the bigger shock was 18 years earlier, they had lived at St. John's with their mom. And the light bulb went off, and it never stopped. We could not continue to be a 30-day emergency shelter and think we were helping people to change the trajectory of their lives. So we started back then, this was about 13 years ago now, building what is now an 18-month program that's residential, with rules, with structure, but lots of education that helps people change their lives forever. And that's what we do.
Great. Thank you very much for that. Director Marboot, you've been on the job for about a month, and as I understand it, living in airplanes and hotels for most of that time, so we appreciate you spending a little bit of it with us. You've brought some brand new data with you showing the scope of the homelessness problem in America, and as I understand it, this is the first time that this data is being displayed publicly anywhere.
Yes.
So we've got a little bit of an exclusive here at Policy Orientation. Would you mind walking us through the data?
And I don't know who's bringing the slide up. Is somebody? Oh,
He's
there we
bringing
go. There we go. All right. So, and first off, want to thank you and thank these ladies here. One of the things I'm going to be talking about is where we went off the rails, and you're going to see that here in a second. But the moving to a transformational model, which is very much like Haven for Hope down in San Antonio, that's how you get success. And I know a lot of people say, well, it's just water. What I have found on the street is there's not enough talk about dehydration, malnutrition, and sleep deprivation on the street. And if you do those 3 things together, you end up exacerbating the mental health, the behavioral health. Whatever you got going on, I guarantee you, if I took you and had you not sleep for 3 or 4 days, dehydrate you, and feed you donuts, I guarantee you, you're going to be a different type of person. And so what they're doing is amazing, because that's what really changes on the street. Now, let me show you what the federal government's been doing nutty for a while. Okay, so if you were to follow the narrative of homelessness, you'll even see some stuff this week out there. Everybody says homelessness is about 450,000 to 525,000, somewhere in this sort of area, and we've been going down. That literally has been the narrative year after year, and we've been tortuously trying to fit data to make that narrative work. And so what I did was I took 3 different charts in the HUD report and put them all in one place. So I wanted to be able to see data in one screenshot. I also have some Department of Education data here too. So this is HUD data. It's right out of the annual report. The acronym is called AHAR. And what you will see, now, by the way, the money that is being spent by the federal government from this year to this year has gone up 250% in that time frame. So this is not a revenue issue. If you spend money the wrong way, you can actually make things worse. I went to the Claremont colleges, and so Peter Drucker, it's now called the Peter Drucker School, and he used to beat into everybody. He said, what gets measured gets done, and if you measure the wrong thing gets done. And likewise, the corollary is if you measure the right thing will get done. So what I've done, and I'll do a quick orientation, this is street-level homelessness. This is what we see right outside, coming over an Uber from the airport. Technically, it's called unsheltered homelessness, but this is what you see in the streets, the parks, the river bends. The orange is emergency sheltering, then the yellow is transitional, and then the blue is permanent supportive, sometimes called housing first. And part of this story is what's going on here with these red lines. This is called rapid rehousing, and we're going to walk through it. So the big takeaway is from 2007 to 2014, we had been dropping 31.4%. Homelessness, street level, visual homelessness, unsheltered, whatever you want to call it, wherever you are, the part of the country calls it different things. The numbers have been going down. That's not an annualized number. That's from 07 to 14, a 31% drop. Since 2014, it's gone up 20.5%. Think of this. That's for those of you mathematician types, that's a 50% inflection point in 1 year. And you'll also notice, for those of you who really sorry to get too wonky here, but linear regression, least squared, lines of R's, et cetera, you'll see the line almost is perfect. There's a little dip there, and there's a couple dips here, but other than that, everything on this fits in the line. That you just don't see that much in human, capital type of studies. So we have this huge drop, and then we start to go up. Then the overall homelessness system, which means this is all the beds we're paying for in the country. This is what people are not in. This is the unsheltered. That number has gone up 15.6%. It was flat for 3 years here, had a little bump, and then it was flat for 4 years. And then it takes off. So something's happening in 2013, 2014, and it's not affordable housing. Affordable housing is actually happening here, and so it doesn't actually match. It's part of this story, but it's a much smaller part of the story. So this is HUD data. Now, if we could go to the next slide, this is Department of Education data. Do we have it?
I think we only had that once.
Oh, okay. All right. So we'll go. Okay. So we have some Department of Education data. I'll show you on my small phone. It does the same thing, but it is flat from 07 to 14. It's literally a flat line, and then it takes off here. And that is looking at K through 12 individuals, and they have them by name, by school, classroom, school, everything. I mean, we got deep detail on it. And what you've seen is that number is jumped. In fact, the number of individual families, or the total family unit, so if it's a 4-person family, it counts as 4. That has doubled in the last year in terms of street-level family living on the streets. So the numbers are off the chart. So this begs the question, what goes on here? Because it is literally like turning on a light switch. This is not a slow thing. This is not a casual thing. Something really changes right in here. And this is when a series of different administration changes things. And what they change is they say, we're no longer about the roof combined with services. It used to be you had services combined. What you're doing, what she's doing, transformation, they unhooked the housing, and it basically just became a housing voucher, and they moved away from services. Under the prior years, housing and services were required. We actually required it. Not unlike a Pell Grant. You have to have a 12 hours, you have to have a certain GPA of 2.0, you have to finish in X amount of years. We do that in every program. Even Section 8 has requirements and such. But for some reason, we decided in 2014, we're going to have no requirements. We're just going to give it to you. And it went from required to not incentivized to you couldn't spend more than 24% on services to 2 years ago when the Trump administration started taking this on and the president got deep into this. When he got it, it came to his desk. Literally, you were not allowed to use services. It was like you couldn't spend services money. You had to, if you wanted to go do it, you had to do it on your own. You couldn't require anything. Last year, we finally made the change that we're starting to reverse it. It's a small step. We're going in the right direction now. And it said you can use services. And so we're trying to relink. But when you had a house and a roof, and here's what the problem is. Without services, without addressing what the catalytic event that lost you the house in the first place, you're going to lose it a second time or a third time or doing faster. In medical terms, that would be the equivalent of rushing somebody to an ER. You got a great building, but you have no doctors and nurses. I mean, it literally is that equivalent, or saying we're just doing a roof over your head and we're not doing whatever the catalytic event that lost that address. So we have to fix that. We have to address that. You have to work that in order to get people to graduate into, my measurement is how many people graduate completely out of homelessness. How many people get completely out and go to market rate economy and are actually a taxpayer, renting a house, owning a house and such. And so the other little thing here, you'll notice this little red line, which I think is one of the most insidious things ever done by HUD. This is called rapid rehousing. And if you'll see, the yellow starts to switch. They basically stay about the same. But there was this idea that we're going to rehouse her. We're measuring how fast you get housed, not how long you're sustained in housing, not how many people graduate from housing, not how many people are ready for housing. We measure how fast we get you into a place. And services, for most of the grants, the service requirement was 1 hour of case management once a month. And if you miss 3 times in a row, then you have some issues. That's literally it, versus the transformational, which is basically a 24/7 program. This came a once a month, just basically a touch point. So we're measuring the wrong thing. So we started saying, how fast can you get housing? Now only this happens in Washington, D.C. The red here was defined by HUD as not being homeless, even though the reason why you got the free in the voucher was because you were homeless. And in the yellow line, they said you're still homeless. Now, so the grants changed, and most of the nonprofits that were there before under the transitional housing in yellow started doing rapid rehousing in red. Most of their customers and guests were the same, not all, but most were. And they were often in the exact same location they were before. And 110,000 people left this program, 109,000 entered this program, and we overnight were able to call that a success, and you're now no longer homelessness. So we dropped the number $109,000 people on a percent of about 450, 500. That's how you get that homelessness drop. That's when the people are telling you that, this is not counted anymore. Even though it was the same program, we just changed the program name. But that's not the only time these ladies know it. We've changed the definition of chronic homelessness 4 times since 2000. 2 major ones, 2 small ones, and we've changed the rule a couple times. Now, I know this is a quick quiz. How many times when you made those 6 changes did homelessness go up? Every time it went down when we changed the definition. And so this is why I wanted to get one graph and look at the whole system. And this is what the scariest to me at all. There was a narrative that said as the blue line went up, this is if we do housing first, it will end homelessness. Remember that motto. And so the idea was, the narrative is the more you did blue, this line would go down and this line would go down. The irony is it's actually gone the other way. Because now people go in and get a place, and the Clinton years of the reform of the social welfare started adding transparency and requirements in most everything, continued through the Bush years, but for this whatever reason, everybody woke up and said, in the world of homelessness, we're going to make it no requirements and no required service and treatment recovery. And so that's why you end up here. And so this has become, and for those of you who follow such things, the President Trump has talked more about homelessness than all the other presidents combined since the Interagency Council was formed under President Reagan. He's talked more on that than everybody else combined. And all you have to do is look out the window, go drive to the airport here, and you see that. So what we're trying to do is get the services. At first, let's talk about real numbers. That'd be a novel approach. But let's look at the real numbers, and this is all in one place, and then we want to recapture and get the services in.
Can I just add one thing? Because I want to make sure it's clear. When he says services are not required, that means sobriety too. Sobriety is not allowed to be required by HUD. If you look at data, 75 to 80% of the homeless are struggling with addiction. But you're not allowed to, for those people, require sobriety.
And if you were paying attention to the news here in Austin recently, our city council is undertaking a plan to buy old motels to house the homeless. And they very publicly said, we are not going to require sobriety. We are not going to require anything of the people that we house in these motels. It's just a roof over their head. And this is a project that's been about a year in development at TPPF prior to this panel. And I remember one of the first times, Michelle, you and I sat down to actually talk about what is the low-hanging fruit? What do we need to do something about right now? She brought up this idea of housing first. And I tell you, my jaw hit the floor.
Not supporting it.
No, not supporting it. Not, yes. She brought up the idea of we have to do something
Blowing
about
it
housing
up.
first. Because housing first is the poisonous tree that's causing all of these problems. And my jaw just about hit the floor when she told me, if you are an effective organization and you require people that you serve to do job training classes or to go through addiction recovery, mental health treatment, anything, if you ask them to do anything that would help them better their situation, you are prohibited under the HUD rules from actually receiving funding. That is, for all intents and purposes, as HUD looks at it, illegal to have expectations.
Haven for Hope down the street, when we started Haven for Hope, and if you ever see Bill Grieve, Valero Energy, he was just amazing what he did, and Governor Abbott's been very supportive. And he told me a couple weeks ago, we have not received any federal funding, because I did the project for 5 years, and then I started going around the country. He said, we've not received any federal funding since 2011. And we have placed 13,000 in permanent supportive or market rate housing, and we've reduced street level homelessness in San Antonio 85%. Still means there's still people on the street, there's still panhandlers, but from where our baseline is, we're in our 9th year of an 85% reduction. And at that time, the amount of people experiencing homelessness in San Antonio and Austin on the street were exactly the same. It was within 100 people in the measurements. And we took an approach that did not follow the federal model and followed a treatment and recovery model, holistic model, and it works. It's what you did, and it's partly what you're doing. That's how that works. But when you move away and just say, I'm giving a voucher away with no, and to me, the key is you have to require treatment and recovery. And we know some people won't be successful. Some people might take a few times to go through. That's real life. I mean, we all deal in the world of gray, and that's okay. But to say we're requiring nothing and we're just giving you something, what I'm seeing in most places, it actually puts whatever your bad habits, whatever the challenges you have, whatever your catalytic event that triggered that homelessness, I actually think it makes things tremendously worse and allows you to shoot up or do drugs by yourself. Or I've been to housing first places that have become all-out brothels. And so to me, it just seems crazy that we don't want to say you want to create address that catalytic event that got you down that path of homelessness. It's saying, oh, we're going to ignore that. We're just going to give you the roof, and then we're going to wait. And what they always say, well, if they want services, they can ask. And that just doesn't happen in real life.
There's actually a term, and maybe you remember what it is, Dr. Drew uses. It's a medical term, right? It's, do you know that? It starts with an A. Anyway, what he says, a lot of people know him as the Love Line talk show host, right? But he has deep expertise in adult medicine, addiction medicine. And what he says is there is a medical condition that starts with an A that creates a deficit of self-awareness. And his estimates are, based on his 30 years of experience, 80% of those struggling with addiction or mental illness will not opt for services. So this whole notion that we're going to stick them in a house and then they can opt for services, it does not work. Not to mention the fact that those houses are distributed, right? So the distribution of services to those distributed units is very ineffective. It's very costly. And I know in California, I don't know about here in Texas, but I would imagine it's very similar. We are not producing the number of behavioral health specialists that we need to even address the current need, let alone this distributed model need. So it's craziness.
Elena, from facts on the ground, how have you seen this policy actually impacting the lives and dignity of individuals and families who are experiencing homelessness?
Well, I mean, the tricky thing about talking about homelessness, right, is just there's so many things that create, deliver someone into being homeless. So, I mean, just listening to the two of you talk, I think the growing population of homeless are families, and it looks so different all over the country. For instance, in LA, you have a lot of RVs, and people are parking them near the school zones of where, their kids were going to school when they had an apartment or a house, so they can at least keep some semblance of continuity for the child by living in an RV near the school. And I think, unfortunately, the drug addicted and the criminal aspect of homelessness that we see really creates a lot of disgust, really, in the public opinion about who the homeless are. And, it's kind of like the iceberg analogy. It's like the tip of the iceberg are the street homeless. The greater body of the homeless are underneath the water. You don't see them. They're invisible. They're, couch surfing. They're doubled up. They're living all over. I'm going to answer your question, Andrew. But as it relates to the whole housing thing, I am not a huge proponent of housing, I think, if that's what your question was, because I think it's super expensive, and it's affordable housing. It's not free housing. And if you don't have some type of check or stipend or something, you don't move into a unit. You don't get to have a unit. Yeah. And I want to add one more thing.
Please do.
Okay, so the water. When I think about what's happened, your graph is amazing, and I would love to see the Department of Education graph. But at this point, we've had homelessness for a long time. People have been for years now homeless. We're just seeing the street population really start to spike, but there have been people that have been homeless for years. And it's not going to be any small task to get the people that have been homeless willing to come out of the bushes, because not every homeless person that's not in the system or that lives under a bridge or lives in an encampment, not all of them are mentally ill or on drugs. It's not the case. But there have been homeless people that have been homeless for such an extent, years now, and they don't know Mr. Marbut yet and the new change that's coming. One of the big difficulties of getting people to become, because my whole thing is, they're taxpayers, they're Americans, they're people that would be willing to come in if you can get them in. To me, this is where the water, this conversation, this ability to start opening up someone on a psychological soul level, they're all very disenfranchised, invisible, hiding, the ones that are not, defecating on the sidewalk and passed out, which is, again, a very small part of the population of homeless. Is that discussion, is creating a relationship with, this is the human aspect. They're humans. And they're very, very traumatized humans for the reasons Mr. Marbut said, with dehydration. They feel that they've been left behind. And there's a system that maybe once in a blue moon rounded on them through a van or something, saying, we'll give you a hot and a cot, but they really just wanted to vote or register them to vote. Or we'll do this for you, or we'll do that for you. And a lot of people have become very jaded. And the level of unwillingness, I think, to come back into a system, because the system has been so messed up for so long and nobody knows that better than the homeless, is not going to be a very small feat at all. And to me, this conversation, you're not going to be able, we don't want to throw any more money at it. We don't need to. There's actually already enough money in the system. It's just, how do you apply that, reallocate, apply, and that includes, SAMHSA, and that's another conversation. But the affordable housing, it needs to be affordable. And there's probably other alternatives to it, in terms of like the 3D printed houses, tiny houses, the community-based. I think it has to be about a community. We heard this earlier, I think, at breakfast. People thrive in communities. And people need love, and they need support. And they need to be a part of a greater community that they feel that is really going to be there for them, and the bureaucracy hasn't been. So,
yeah, I want to come back to that idea of community, but we've got that other graph up and functioning, Director Marbut.
Yeah, thanks for being my tech support here. So, all right, this is Department of Education data, and what's interesting, it has a total different methodology. This is done by the classroom teacher who goes to the counselor, who then registers the person as part of a federal law, and it's called McKenty-Vento law. So Department of Education data is really, really accurate, because you know the person, the name, the school, the age, the classroom, what district, what city, et cetera. And so I'll point out the key stuff. Red is unsheltered, and see this jump here, it's doubled just in the last year, but it's been going up steadily. The blue is hotel and motel, because there's a view that a family, you don't want to live on a street, because of the prostitution, the crime on the street, so you want to move them in a hotel, motel pretty quick, as fast as you can. That's the theory. And then the green is a sheltered. And so, again, look at the numbers. Under the old policy, 2007 right into the 13-14, it actually dropped just ever so slightly. It's basically flat. Again, you got one outlier here, but that's it. Then you go into this new policy, and there's a lot of people really smart in the world, the Barbara Duffields, you, that are into the family space, will say rapid rehousing is the most dangerous thing you do, because you move the kiddos around inside of the school year. And again, this number is 27.5%, same time frame that you saw in the HUD, with the totally different complete metrics. And we don't have really time to go in. This is the double up number. It's hard to, we don't have time for that conversation. But here's the key thing about kiddos and why the two charts tie to each other. we're finding on the I-5 corridor, which is, if you add Honolulu, New York, it's really an I-5 corridor with the few pockets, like Austin's become basically a new Berkeley, to be real honest about it. And so what you're seeing on the children and in the street, there used to be a theory these are very different worlds and such. In LA, they just found out just this last year, 23% of the people on the street in LA experiencing homelessness first started experiencing homelessness as a kiddo. The further north you go, the higher the number gets, and there's some reason because of weather and why that happens. But apparently, there's some places up in Washington State where it's about 50%. And so there's a direct tie. If we don't deal with this here, we're doing it a second generation, a third generation, and such. And so that's why this is so critical that we work the youth side, the family side, and go. And here's where the clinical level, why the rapid rehousing issue is so bad. What we know from research of families that are military families who move a lot, and we know a lot of research about relocation, redevelopment of companies and such. When a kiddo moves in middle of the school year, a student moves, and I'm not talking the first week and I'm not talking the last week, but you're in the middle. When you relocate a child, on an average, they lose 4.5 months of education when they move. And so rapid rehousing, this is why her story is so amazing. 12 schools, and how many of those are in middle of the school year? It's that removement and unsettling thing in the middle. Again, rapid rehousing doesn't measure the stability of the classroom, the stability of the student, or even the stability of the housing. It's measuring how fast we get you a house, even if you're not ready for it, to keep it. And so my view is you can match services up and housing together at the same time. That's what we used to do. Measure, put them together at the same time, and then that's how you get stability. And that's where this is all self-inflicted. I mean, that's what's crazy about it. And if you look at the housing costs, which I don't know if we have time to do, but if you look at the housing costs in California, their Prop Triple H, which they just put out, they just opened their first units after it took 3 years to open them. And the units they just opened last week is $548,000 per unit.
For a studio.
That's affordable housing. Mm-hmm. And so I said, they said, well, what can we do about it? I said, if you really want to get serious about affordable housing, you got to get serious about affordable construction. So there are 3 things you can do in California. Waive every single fee, platting fee, hookup, if you're serious about it. If you really think this is our #1 issue in California, which, by the way, there are 5 states now, homelessness is the #1 domestic policy issue. So if you want to get serious, waive every single fee for affordable housing. Get rid of all your crazy regulation. I mean, and it is crazy. I mean, some of these cities have 35, 40 different parts to go, whereas the rest of America has 6, 7, or 8 on an average. You have to have fire safety. You got to have earthquake. You're in California. Those 2 you need. But all these others that talk about recycling and wetlands and helicopter landing pads and parking spots, and I mean, I joke a little bit, but not really. And I'll give you the one. I went to a place last week, Santa Monica, true life story. They got a LIHTC tax credit. The city of Santa Monica sponsored it. It was a good project. They were going. They got it all approved. They were going out, and they got an internal agreement that they weren't going to build this much parking because the project director said, we just don't need a lot of parking. 6 months in the project, the inspector goes out, red tags the project, stops the project, says you don't have enough parking. So for 6 months, they battle between one side of the city who's trying to get the project up and out by December 31st or lose the funding, or having the parking requirement, the right amount ratio. And the project director kept saying, we don't need that much parking. And they kept saying, but you have to have it because it's the law. So they never got to an impasse. So the city council and the pro side that was trying to get the project up gave them an extra $2.5 million. Instead of waiving the parking, they gave them an extra $2.5 million for the project. This is a true life story. And gave them $2.5 million. They got the project up. It closed at 4 p.m. on December 31st. 2 hours before deadline. It did get closed. It finally got built. And as of Wednesday, how many parking spots do you think were being used by the guests at this project? So if you're going to spend I have a facility that I helped set up in Florida. The annual budget for 470 people for the primary budget of the facility is $2.7 million. So if you're going to give $2.5 million away for and by the way, they had to buy, because of the way, in order to keep the right amount of units, they had to go to Germany to get these parking lifts. That it was the only parking lifts that could actually fit the plot of the land to do it. I mean, this goes nutty on top of nutty. That's why all three of us left California. I mean,
Can I just, this is what I term as the homeless industrial complex. That's one of the hashtags that I use on Twitter. But yeah, it's ridiculous. And the Prop HHH, which was $1.5 billion, or
$1.4 billion.
Okay, well, they only built a third of the amount of product that they were supposed to with that money. Yep. So not even all the product is there.
Can I add one thing?
Yes, please.
Okay, so I just want to...
Poor moderator, he doesn't get to talk. We've just taken over.
This is the best kind of panel when you have experts that are just feeding off of each other. I hope y'all are enjoying
I
it.
want to add to what Robert's saying about the difference between how HUD measures families and how the Department of Education measures families. And we've been arguing at the federal level about this for, almost 10 years. The HUD says a family is not homeless if they're couch surfing or garage surfing, if they're paying for their own motel room. In the case of St. John's, that is we serve about 270 women and children a day, about 1,000 annually. That's 60% of our families. They're either couch surfing or paying for their own motel room, because what happens if they go to the streets? Number one, it's very scary. But number two, CPS will come and take their kids. So they do everything they can to avoid going to the street. The Department of Education, as Robert pointed out, has a much more realistic definition, and it's done at the child level. And so the Department of Education is showing a massive, as you see here, increase in the number of homeless families, children and families. HUD is out there literally right now telling people that the number of homeless families is going down rapidly. But it's based on this definition. And what people don't often connect the dots on is when a family is not counted as literally homeless, that means they're not funded by the HUD dollars. So shelters who are reliant largely on government funding or HUD funding won't accept those families because they don't get reimbursed for them. It's a huge problem.
We've spent a lot of time, and before we wrap up and open for Q&A from the audience, I want to talk about some of the bright spots that you all see. What cities, states, service providers out there, what are examples of folks who are doing it right and who we should be looking to as we build a vision for the future of how to actually solve this problem?
Sadly, to me, the best programs I'm seeing, before I started this a month ago, I'd been traveling all over the country doing sort of like trying to get Haven for Hope set up around the country. And sadly, to me, all the bright spots in the world of homelessness have nothing to do with government. It's in spite of government, for the most part. I mean, that, I literally, that's true. Sarasota, where your mom lives, has one of the absolute best family programs, and it's the YMCA, and I mean the federal government. They have a lot of the school districts involved, local YMCAs involved. They have 3 family foundations that have gotten together and got it working. And we took a situation where 19,000 kiddos did not have food during the summer and Christmas on a steady basis. We went into the school districts and said, can we set up some of your elementary schools, use your commercial kitchen, let's hire some of your staff during the summer, so they got a little extra money, and we were able to feed everybody who needed to be fed and backpack them and such. And so that's the innovation, and they won 2 fabulous big-time awards, and they're doing it, and they're keeping the kiddos in the classroom and such. and it's the local innovation that's getting it done. And they almost get no federal money because it, quote, doesn't qualify because it's not the one size fits all, top down. And the thing I've learned in the last 2 years is what you need in Wyoming is not what you need in LA, and it's not what you need in Austin, Texas. The needs are completely different, but we, for the infinite wisdom, have said we're going to have a one size fits all down. And that's what's being so great about this president and this administration is we're going to start changing that. I mean, and we know we're over the target because we're getting shot at. I mean, you know, I was saying earlier that if you talk to an old Navy or Air Force aviator, Army aviator from World War II, that's before GPS and you know, ground radar and all the things. So they always knew they were over the target when they were getting the most flack. I mean, and they knew we're there because that's where the guns were. And the three of us, we're getting the emails and such. It is crazy what's happening. But the greatest news in the last 6 weeks is an honest conversation has started, and the president has started it. And he got it going. And now people are saying housing first. And the greatest thing I saw was there's a person we all know. She kept saying housing first, housing first. Housing first will solve all of homeless. Well, clearly not working there. And then the sort of concerted effort to change the dialogue that came from the president, the administration, and with my appointment now, it then became housing first will end all homeless, comma, we need more money. And it's changed in the last 3 weeks. Well, we've gone up 250% funding in the same way, and we're not doing it right. So let's at least get it right first before you start asking for more money.
All right, we have a few minutes for audience Q&A, and I know we probably won't get to everybody. In order to get as many questions in as possible, please abide by the Foundation's golden rule of your question ends in a question mark.
I agree that this policy change is bad, but I'm a little confused because I feel like you're trying to attribute an increase to giving people homes as an explanation for an increase in people not having homes. Am I a little confused?
Half right. You're right on the first part, but the second is it has nothing to do with homes. It is removing services. Because here's the key math. When you look at those, can you flip back to that prior chart? When service is required, here's what happens. When services are required, you have people graduating from the system. See how the blue is actually getting bigger? We actually are getting more people in permanent supportive housing here. But basically, this is flattish. You got 4 flat years here and 3 flat years here. So people are actually getting housed in a more quality way. But because you have services, you also have some people going into market rate, exiting the whole system. So you have people actually leave the system. So when you stop the services, we've stopped the amount of people graduating. And so overall, this is now doubled. You know, we've put twice as many people into permanent housing, if you will, but the overall number's gone up and the street number's gone up. So it's not the house, it's the removal of that services from that system.
How much does recidivism contribute to that in terms of you may have put somebody in a house, but you didn't address the underlying issue, so they eventually cycled out of that house and came back?
Citygate, to me, is probably one of the best measures because they have about 400 affiliates. They're the old Union Rescue Mission, Gospel Rescue Mission group. They rebranded about 2 years ago. And what they tell me is their affiliates report a 20 to 50% recidivism rate in 6 months under the new programming. I mean, that's crazy. I mean, it's not working. Because just common sense, whatever the catalytic event that lost you the house in the first place, if you don't address that and we just say, hey, don't worry, it didn't work out the first time when you were paying for it, now we're paying for it, the taxpayer, we'll give it to you again and let's see how this works out. I mean, it doesn't. You know, we need to address that trigger or you're going to lose it a second time or a third time. And what Citygate is finding, not only are the recidivism rates going up, but the speed in which you lose the house the second time is speeding up. Everything's going faster now.
Well, and the irony, to add to what Robert's saying, is the federal government, well, it's not an irony, right? They don't measure recidivism. there's no requirement to measure recidivism.
What gets measured gets done.
That's right.
Chris Miller from the Chris Miller Show, San Antonio, LLC. So I have kind of two questions. What do we do when we're not allowed to feed the homeless, and if we are a church trying to help out the homeless and allowing them to shower in our facilities once a week? So Pastor Alex from Life Restored Church in San Antonio is actually having to go to battling the city council and city code enforcers because they're trying to shut him down because he's doing exactly what his prime directive is, based upon the Word of God. That's my first question. And I just want to make kind of another question about what are we going to do about this motel situation? Is that a real thing? And if it is, that has to be stopped. And how do we stop that? Because what we're doing is establishing a legal trap house. Basically, anywhere in Austin they put this up, they're obviously going to turn into something that's far worse than any tenement or housing project that could be imagined. These places are immediately they're going to become a self-contained ghetto. They're going to have their own set of health and safety rules. Drug dealers will set up shop immediately, and turf wars will ensue and secure. They're just going to be trying to secure complete control of these crack motels. The only people that will want to live there or will be able to live there are those who do, or dare to live in close proximity to these hardcore drug dealers or people with nothing to lose.
So your first question was around what do we do about city regulations that are prohibiting churches from housing the homeless, prohibiting them from even feeding the homeless. So we saw it also up in Dallas over the winter. And then the second question is what do we do about these no-barrier, free-for-all motels that the city council is setting up? Yeah. Does anybody want to tackle those?
Everybody's looking at me. Okay.
Well, you're from San Antonio, so weren't you on the city council?
Yeah, I was on the city council.
Talk to your city council members.
Yeah.
They need to hear.
I don't know the specifics, but here's what we know. I try to focus on what we know works. And what we know works is if you have what you're describing is part of a wraparound package. We used to call it wraparound services, sometimes permanent supportive services. Now it's trauma-informed treatment. The names have changed. But what you want to do is when you get that package, you want to pair it with other programs. That's what Haven for Hope does. That's what Star of Hope does in Houston. That's what there's several programs around the country that are St. Patrick's and St. Louis. You want to put and coordinate the services together. You don't want the agencies independently operating on their island and you have to walk between services and such. So what does work is when you get those services and work it as a system of 2 or 3 or 4. Haven's huge. I get it. I get we're different. Haven has over 100 providers all in one roof. But if it's a smaller community, I've worked with some people, for example, up in Lubbock over the years on and off, and they have 2 or 3 programs. And I said, how much do they work together? And they said, well, why would they work together? Literally, that was my first phone call. It was, why would you work together? And I'm like, because we need everybody's help to do this. It's only going to work if you do it. But if you don't coordinate, what you have are weird deals. Like I know a St. Vincent de Paul in Florida that serves their breakfast at 10:30 in the morning. Well, all the job training programs are at 8 in the morning that go to 4. And we went and asked them, why don't you move your services from 7 to 8 in the morning so that people could get there and then we can bus and coordinate the services. And they literally told me that's not good for their tea times of the volunteers. And I just thought, because that's who we're about trying to do. I meant policies matter, and so you want to coordinate the services that align with the other services. So you want to pack it, and they don't have to be at the same place, but you got to coordinate them.
And one of the things we're really excited about this initiative at TPPF and working with you, Director Marbut, is addressing some of these policies that we've talked about today that create these perverse incentives and the regulations that come down where cities, states, counties, and even the federal government are doing absolutely insane things that need to be undone.
My name is Meg Wilson, and my question is this. I know that mental health issues are a huge part of this policy and service package, but my concern is that we don't have a good handle on mental health services. We've destroyed a lot of them. We don't have residential facilities anymore like we used to, and some people need it. So what does the mental health service part of the package look like, and what's working?
Well, I can just say, you can talk about Dr. Drew. At St. John's, we self-fund. We built our entire mental health unit. It's internal to St. John's. It's headed by a licensed psychologist. We have people with their masters and their PhDs, and we run an intern program for people trying to get their masters or PhDs. We do not get one dime of public funding for those services. The mental health provided by the county, which is what most of our clients access, does not almost ever provide counseling anymore. It's all medication-based. And what's really integral to, so I agree with you, mental health is, 75% of our women are struggling with mental illness. What's really integral, however, in our model is the mental health counselors maybe are meeting with you for a half an hour or an hour a week. That's not very much time to really get their arms around who you are and what you're struggling with. And by the way, at the beginning, I'm a little reticent to tell you everything because I don't want to be judged, right? But the mental health counselors at St. John's are talking to the children's program folks, who are talking to the night staff folks, who are talking to the employment training folks. Once a week, we all get together and we talk about our clients and where they really are, where their kids are, and we really get at those root issues that again, if you listen to Dr. Drew, and I can't remember the name of that disease, the A disease, but 80% of our clients are really lacking self-awareness when they come to us. It's not that they necessarily are trying to manipulate. They just don't understand what led them into the situation. So it's this comprehensive, integrated approach that really, really leads to transformation and that really leads to success.
Yeah, I'd love to add to that because it's a great question. I think there's no shortage of money, I'll say it again, of funds. But the mental health industry has had such a huge impact on SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse Mental Health Association. Yeah. So, it's their positioning, SAMHSA's positioning, instead of money going into psychiatric beds and what I believe we need mental health facilities, mental institutions, it doesn't matter what you call them, we need them. Instead of, funding online bullying and dealing with kids that are bedwetting because their parents got divorced, literally, this is not an exaggeration, mental health is not a crisis. Serious mental illness is a crisis, and a major part of our street homelessness across the United States are the seriously mentally ill, and they're not going to be run through a program. The de facto mental health or mental institutions are our prison systems, and the people that are really, really being taxed out and stuck holding the bag with this huge, deficit of infrastructure for seriously mentally ill are the police. I mean, they're trained now to deal with people that hear voices and schizophrenia and bipolar as a part of their police training. So I think that is something that needs to be addressed. I don't know how that happens, but SAMHSA and the flow of funds, and forget mental health. We need to look at mental illness again in a very serious way and get that infrastructure back for those people.
Just a historical thing. In 1980, we had roughly 475,000 federally funded severe, not acute level mental health and behavioral health beds. And about 6 years ago, I had a real good friend who worked in that space, and he did a little study, and he tried to line up. You can't line up all because all the grants are different, but he did his best to line up. Not counting VA. VA is different. VA is really driven by the operating tempo of DOD. If you have more activity downrange, VA is going to have more activity. Take that off the table. But just general population. 6 years ago, that number was 92,000 beds. And so you went from 475 to 92,000. And to be fair, there was people on one side of the equation who said that should not be the funding of federal government. We shouldn't be putting any money in it. And then on the other extreme, they were watching One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and thought it was a documentary and moved into the deinstitutionalization movement. And that's what Dr. Drew talks a lot about. And so you had this really weird extreme where the right center, left center, middle got outflanked by two real extremes. And we have literally 1/5 the amount of beds we had in 1980, even though our country's gone up almost a little under 30%. So where are people going? They're going right out the boulevard there, just like a quarter mile away. You're going to our jails. We did study in Florida jails, and most of the Florida jails had 20 to 25% people experiencing mental health and homelessness were in for a minor infraction, and often the infraction was less than the first day of jail time. And that's when you start to say, I'm a financial conservative, so if the fine is $80, but you stay 42 days in jail at $115 a day, that's $4,000. I start to does that really make sense? So
that's actually perfect lead-in for my question, which is about criminalization of homelessness, which is what started the political kerfuffle in Austin. Was the city council decriminalized homelessness. In Las Vegas, the city council and the mayor there said that they're going to start arresting people who wouldn't go to a shelter bed if there's one available, and that's, I think, where some of the political divide is. And this panel, where do you fall on that? I mean, do you think that this Austin City Council was right in saying, hey, we're not going to arrest people just because they're sleeping on the street?
no, okay. Yesterday,
we could just go down the line.
Yeah. Yesterday, I was at the Council of Mayors, and I met both with the mayor of Austin, the mayor of Las Vegas, Mayor de Blasio and such, and this was a heavy talk. And there's a new
Blasio's LA.
Yeah. No, New York.
Oh,
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. And so there's a new law of the land now. It's called Martin versus Boise, Idaho. And before you had Pottinger versus Miami. For about 30 years, the Southeastern has lived with that a case called Miami-Dade versus Pottinger. And what it basically says is you can't enforce any ordinances unless you have a capacity in the system of a better alternative. That's way oversimplifying it. So if you have a camping ordinance, you can't arrest or cite on camping unless you have an open bed available in a city-run shelter in a reasonable distance and such. And so that's the law. Those are the two cases that are driving it now. And literally, Boise Supreme Court just refused to hear it 3 weeks ago. So there's a lot of shaking out on this right now. But the gist of it is, if you want to enforce any ordinances, you have to create your capacity to do that. That's the law of the land right now. Whether you like it or not, that's where we are. And so, and that's where the mayors are struggling with it. And they're having to figure out that means they have to build that capacity if they want to enforce it. But what I know in the real life, and being in this, doing this for 15 years at a very scientific level, no recovery occurs in a jail cell floor. None. Likewise, complete opposite, no recovery occurs in that boulevard park down the street a quarter mile away. There's no recovery happening there. And so where recovery happens and treatment happens is when you run into your organization or your partner organizations or Haven for Hope or Star of Hope or the City Gate. That's where real recovery occurs. If people are working a 24/7 program, 80% eventually will get out of homelessness or get to a sustainable level. We know that to be scientifically data truth. And so if the system's holistic, that's what we need to move people toward. And what I'm finding in the world of law enforcement are the hot teams. I know we don't have time to go through it, but look up hot teams. Sometimes they're called heat teams. Sometimes they're called outreach teams. And you go out with law enforcement with mental health professionals and sometimes some other folks, and they are working fabulous, and they're knocking home run after home run after home run, and they're really working well. So there is a role for law enforcement. There is a role for dealing with that, but let's learn from the cities that are really doing well with it.
And in the meantime, cities are buying bus tickets and just busing the homeless from one. I actually think at this point the mayor of New Jersey wants to build a wall so the mayor of New York cannot bus the homeless from de Blasio can't bus to New York. It's whatever. I know. You can't make it up, right?
And I think this is the reason why we circle back to this issue of root causes, because the question should not be, do we criminalize, do we decriminalize? The question should be, what are we doing to address what is leading people into these situations? And the way that I approach what the city council did, it exposed the problem. Even with Housing First, these things that seem compassionate when you really dig into the issue are the least compassionate things that we can do. Because what we're telling people, the message that we're sending to the folks struggling with issues of homelessness is, you're a nuisance. So we're either going to warehouse you away and forget about you, or we're just going to let you destroy yourself on the street.
I actually call this policy the most oppressive thing we've done in the 20th century.
So, Elena, you've been pretty quiet. You're a good listener. Or Robert, I'd rather you be a little bit quiet for a minute. I'd like to hear you talk about these ideas that they've been talking about. So we've got a lot of data, a lot of things like that. You've got real life experience, and it isn't clear that you're agreeing. It isn't clear that I'd like to understand what you have to say about the various things that have been talked about today.
I'll try to make it quick. So this is what I think. I agree with what they're saying, and obviously, you know, Mr. Marbut has extensive on-the-ground experience, and it requires that, because the concepts that we're talking about are concepts unless you've either lived it or via the work you've been on ground zero. You have to see, you've got to get into the organizations and see the people. But this is what I have battled with pre-Marbut. And again, the usage Twitter is like defund use. You know, I have been like on a rampage with them for like 2 years, but it's like stopped as of like December 19th. So what I think is, you can't fix a problem you haven't defined. And one of my biggest beefs, and I've been extremely vocal about it on social media, is the numbers are wrong. I almost feel like they shouldn't even do a pit count, quite honestly. They should save the money, time, and energy, because there's not 65,000 homeless people in Los Angeles, and I don't know if that includes Orange County and San Fernando Valley and LA County. I don't know.
Can you explain pit count real quick?
Oh, the point in time count, the United States Interagency Council for the Homeless implements this point of time count once a year through their continuum of care agencies, which are over, through different cities across the nation. And the methodology by which they're using, that they're counting, is flawed. There have been studies about this. And the other thing is just, it's a waste of time. All of the information on the internet about the homeless in the United States is coming out of usage. And if you Google homelessness in the United States, you'll say, well, all right, I mean, there's like 562,000 people, but then you have to read the fine print on any given night. And it doesn't include women and children and domestic abuse shelters, and it doesn't include couch surfing, and it doesn't include people doubled up or living in RVs, and all of this stuff. So as we move forward and say that we want to solve homelessness in the United States, which are millions of people, not 562,000, there has to be a very clear picture. And I'm sure, there's something called the HMIS database. I've never had direct access to it, but I know from...
Say what it is.
It's the Homeless Management Information System.
Thank
you. I've had a lot of interaction with it.
So if you were to go into any continuum of care in any given city's HMIS database, you would see that the homeless, that they're doing, unduplicated services, which they collect through the nonprofits. And not even the HMIS database is correct, because not all of the organizations that are in a city are working with the continuum of care agencies. So that's still not even the whole picture. So there's a lot of disconnect. There's not one full connection of the dots. And the compelling reason to obviously do this is for the kids. There are millions. The University of Chicago came out with a study not too long ago. I think it was Chapin Hill is the department at Chicago, University of Chicago. You know, they say we have 4.3 million homeless youth in the United States. That doesn't include this, I don't believe, because youth is 18 to 25. So, you know, that's 4.3 million. I don't know if the McKinney-Vento or the Department of Education, is this 1.5 million? Each of those 1.5 million children have at least one parent with them, or they would be in foster care. And so what I would like to see is, I would like to see one number, one real number, because you would have people that would have a very different stance on immigration. If you knew that we had 10 million homeless people in the United States, that were families and mothers, and you know, and what that does to a mother with a single mom with children or families, it's a very, very ugly picture. And if we don't get a hold of this 10 or 15 million people that are homeless, sometimes homeless, stuck in the station of homelessness, you end up, jump ahead 20 years. Jump ahead and know that the brain activity of a child that grows up, I still deal with food insecurity. You know, I live, my other life is in the 1 percentile. I still have food insecurity. There's just things that never leave you. And the trauma that's created by a developing brain of a child, we need to deal with this. It's an emergency situation that has been buried under all these other idiotic, greenwashing of everything else, and I don't need to get into it, but this should be the absolutely most important topic in the United States right now, because these are Americans. There's not a lot of illegal aliens. I'm sorry. There's just not a lot of illegals. You go, they're blacks, they're whites, they're Americans, they're people that can't get jobs, but after 4 decades of welfare and food stamps that have completely destroyed the work ethic, because we had I am jobs too, it's very difficult. The work ethic has been hurt. Yes, people are being brought in over the border to work because there's a destroyed work ethic. So but people want to work. People want to vote. People want to have gifts so they can, money so they can buy their families, you know, Christmas gifts. They want to be able to live like human beings, not in dumpsters, not in back alleys. Moms don't want to have to sell their bodies to get enough money for food to feed their children. And it's hard to believe that all of this is taking place in the United States. And there are parts of our country that look like a third world nation now. So I would say the most important thing is the numbers. We still don't have a real picture of what homelessness in the United States looks like. And until we do, you can't solve a problem you haven't defined, in my opinion. So.
Well, I think that's a great place to leave it. I feel like we could talk about this for a few more hours, but unfortunately we are on a hard stop. Thank you all for being here. Please join me in thanking our panelists.